Close your eyes, take a slow breath. Tonight we are going to the most violent, complicated, emotionally devastating corner of the entire animated multiverse, and somehow you are going to fall asleep there. Welcome to the world of Invincible, and specifically, the lore that made Season 2 one of the most talked about chapters in modern animation history. If you have never seen Invincible before, do not worry. We are going to ease you in like a warm bath that slowly, gently reveals it has been full of cosmic horror this entire time. And if you are already a fan who just wants to drift off to the sound of someone walking through all the magnificent detail woven into this show, then you are absolutely in the right place. Tonight we go deep, we go slow, we go through every layer of lore that made Season 2 feel like an earthquake that kept happening even after it was supposed to stop. So settle in, pull your blanket up, let the world outside your window do whatever it needs to do. None of that matters right now. Right now we are talking about Mark Grayson, a boy who inherited a universe of responsibility, pain, and impossible choices. And we are talking about the universe that crushed him under its weight and expected him to keep flying anyway. Let us start at the very foundation, because every structure this massive deserves to be understood from the ground up. Mark Grayson grew up believing his father was the greatest hero who had ever lived. Nolan Grayson, known to the world as Omni-Man, was a Viltrumite, a member of a warrior civilization so physically powerful and so deeply committed to their own supremacy that they had spent thousands of years conquering planets and absorbing weaker species into their empire. The Viltrumite philosophy was not subtle. Strength was everything. Weakness was an insult to existence itself. And the empire they built stretched across the cosmos like a slow-moving catastrophe that no one could stop, because no one was strong enough to even try. Nolan had been sent to Earth decades before the events of the show. His mission, delivered quietly and without fanfare, was to prepare the planet for eventual integration into the Viltrumite Empire. The plan was not dramatic or sudden, it was patient. Nolan would embed himself in human civilization, gain trust, become beloved, start a family, and when the time was right, when Earth had been softened from the inside, the Viltrumites would arrive and the planet would simply become theirs. But something happened that the Viltrumite Empire had not anticipated. Nolan fell in love, genuinely, deeply, in a way that complicated everything. He loved Debbie. He loved Mark. He built a life that he was not supposed to care about, and then he spent years pretending he did not care about it as much as he did, because caring was not something his civilization valued. This internal fracture, this war between the cold Viltrumite programming running through his identity and the warm human life growing around his heart, that is the engine of everything we see in Season 1, and by the time Season 2 begins, that engine has already exploded. Nolan has fled Earth after a confrontation with Mark that left both of them broken in different ways. The physical damage was one thing. The psychological damage was something the show would spend its entire second season slowly mapping. Now here is where the lore gets genuinely fascinating, because Invincible Season 2 is not really a story about punching. It is a story about inheritance, about what gets passed down from parent to child, whether you want it or not, about what it means to discover that the person you loved most was also something monstrous, and then to look in the mirror and wonder how much of that monster lives inside you. Mark carries Viltrumite DNA. His powers come from that bloodline, his ability to fly, his near invulnerability, his strength that increases the longer he survives in combat. All of it is Viltrumite, and the Viltrumite Empire is very interested in him, not because they want to destroy him, but because they want to use him. Because a half-human, half-Viltrumite child who was raised on the planet they intend to conquer is an incredibly useful asset. He knows the planet, he knows the people, he could make the whole process so much cleaner. And Mark knows this. He knows what he is, biologically. What he does not know yet, not fully, is what he is going to choose to be. Let us talk about the Viltrumite Empire in more detail, because the lore surrounding their civilization is one of the richest veins of world-building the show has to offer. Thousands of years before the events we witness on screen, the Viltrumites were not so different from any other powerful civilization. They had disputes, they had factions, they had internal conflict. But at some point, a combination of biological evolution and cultural philosophy converged into something terrifying. They became nearly immortal. They stopped aging in any meaningful way. Their bodies became so resilient that killing a Viltrumite was less a matter of physical force and more a matter of endurance, persistence, and extraordinary circumstance. The problem with becoming nearly impossible to kill is that it tends to breed a particular kind of arrogance. When you cannot be hurt, when you outlive everyone around you, when the universe seems to bend to your strength, you stop asking whether your actions are right. You start asking only whether they are possible, and for the Viltrumites, almost everything was possible. They purged their own civilization of weakness. At some point in their history, a plague reduced the Viltrumite population dramatically, and the survivors were the strongest, the most resilient, the most ruthless. This bottleneck event shaped everything that came after. A civilization of thousands became a civilization of dozens, but those dozens were each individually capable of defeating armies, and they used that capability to build an empire that expanded not through technology or diplomacy, but through raw, overwhelming, unstoppable physical dominance. By the time Season 2 is unfolding, the Viltrumite Empire is ancient and massive and operating with the quiet confidence of something that has never truly lost. They do not rush, they do not panic, they have time, and they know it, and that patience is somehow more frightening than aggression would be. Now, somewhere in the vast architecture of the cosmos that Invincible builds, there is another civilization worth understanding, one that exists in direct and complicated tension with the Viltrumites, and one whose agents are going to become increasingly important as the season progresses. The coalition of planets is essentially what it sounds like, a gathering of species and civilizations who recognized, usually after suffering through it firsthand, that the Viltrumite Empire was an existential threat to everyone who was not a Viltrumite. The coalition does not have anything close to the raw power of a single Viltrumite warrior. What they have is numbers, intelligence networks, and a very long memory for grievances. They track Viltrumite activity, they gather information, they work to undermine and outmaneuver an enemy they cannot simply overpower. One of the most compelling characters connected to the coalition is Alan the alien. Now Alan, when we first encounter him in the broader Invincible story, seems almost comedic. He shows up on Earth regularly to test its champion as part of a routine evaluation program, apparently not realizing for years that he was testing the wrong planet. There is a warmth and an absurdity to Alan that makes him immediately lovable. But as Season 2 develops, Alan transforms into something more significant. His role within the coalition deepens, the stakes around him increase, and through Alan, we begin to understand the true scale of the war that is quietly being waged against the Viltrumite Empire in the spaces between stars. Alan possesses a unique biology. He is an Unopan, but he is a remarkable outlier even among his own species. His body adapts after serious injury, healing and then becoming stronger than it was before the damage occurred. This makes him remarkably difficult to kill permanently, and it means that every near-death experience only makes him more formidable. There is something almost poetic about that, given the themes the show keeps returning to: survival through suffering, becoming harder and stronger, not despite the pain, but because of it. Now let us drift toward the emotional core of Season 2, because the lore is rich, but the heart of it all is human, even when the characters involved are not entirely human themselves. What Season 2 does with Debbie Grayson is quietly one of the most emotionally sophisticated things any animated series has attempted. Debbie is not a superhero, she does not have powers. She is a woman who built her entire adult life around a man she loved, raised a child she adored, built a home and a community and a sense of meaning, and then discovered that the foundation of all of it was a lie of the most profound and violent kind. The grief Debbie carries in season 2 is not just about a marriage ending, it is about an identity being destroyed. Who is she if she is not Nolan's wife? What does it mean that she loved someone who viewed humanity as an inferior species? Does that love become retroactively shameful? Does it invalidate everything she felt? The show refuses to give her easy answers, and that refusal is a form of respect for the complexity of what she is experiencing. She drinks too much. She isolates. She has moments of genuine connection that feel hard-won and precious. And she keeps existing in a world that does not stop moving just because her personal universe has collapsed. The Debbie storyline in season 2 is the show's quiet argument that trauma does not make you noble or strong or better. It just makes you someone who has been through something terrible, and you find your way through it imperfectly and slowly and with a lot of setbacks, and that is actually enough. Meanwhile, Mark is trying to hold together something that has already been fundamentally altered. His relationship with Amber had become strained and eventually ended in the wake of the season 1 revelations. Mark had kept his identity secret from her for too long, and the secrecy itself, the choice to protect her by not trusting her, had poisoned what they had. The end of that relationship is not dramatic in the way superhero stories usually handle heartbreak. It is just sad. Two people who genuinely cared about each other, separated by circumstances that were too big and too complicated to simply love their way through. And then there is Atom-Eve. And the Atom-Eve relationship is where the show does something genuinely masterful with pacing and emotional investment. Eve Wilkins, Atom-Eve, is one of the most powerful beings on the planet. Her ability to manipulate matter at the molecular level is staggering in its implications. She could, theoretically, reshape the world. She could solve resource problems, rebuild destroyed environments, create whatever is needed, wherever it is needed. But the show is thoughtful about the psychological weight of that kind of power. Eve is someone who is constantly aware of the gap between what she could do and what is actually being done. It creates a low-level anguish that runs through her character like a current. Her relationship with Mark develops slowly, organically, built on years of genuine friendship and mutual understanding. They know each other. They have seen each other at their worst and their most uncertain. There is a shorthand between them that romantic relationships between people who met as strangers simply cannot have. And when season 2 begins moving their connection towards something more explicitly romantic, it does not feel rushed or convenient. It feels like the show honoring the slow build of something real. But Eve also carries her own trauma. Her backstory, explored in depth in one of the most emotionally powerful standalone episodes in the show, reveals that she was a created being, the product of a government experiment designed to generate superpowered assets. Her parents, the people who raised her, were not her biological parents in the conventional sense. And their relationship with her was complicated by what she was and what she represented. The episode devoted to her origin manages to be devastating and tender at the same time, and it adds layers to every scene she appears in afterward. Let us travel outward again, back into the cosmic scale, because the lore of season 2 is not content to stay small for long. The sequids are a fascinating and deeply unsettling element of the season's mythology. They are a parasitic species, each individual organism unremarkable, but collectively capable of something that functions like a hive mind, capable of taking control of a host body and operating it as a vehicle. The horror of the sequids is not physical, it is the loss of self. The idea that your body could be walking around, using your voice, wearing your face, while whatever was uniquely you has been pushed somewhere small and powerless inside. They connect to one of the secondary storylines of the season that takes place off-Earth, in the broader cosmos, and they demonstrate the show's commitment to building a universe that contains genuinely different kinds of threats, not just more powerful punches, but conceptually alien dangers that operate by entirely different rules. Speaking of threats that operate by different rules, let us talk about the Flaxans. These are one of the season's more visually memorable adversaries. They come from a dimension where time moves at a radically different rate than in our own. The result is that when they cross over into our dimension, their biology ages extraordinarily rapidly. A Flaxan invasion force that enters our world and is not immediately successful will simply age to death over the course of hours from our perspective, even though they have been fighting for what feels like a much longer time from their own experiential standpoint. It creates a unique military problem. If you can simply outlast the first wave, they lose. The challenge is that each time they come back, they have had, from their perspective, vast stretches of time to analyze the previous failure and develop countermeasures. So each new invasion is fought by a version of their civilization that is generations more advanced than the last. This is the kind of science fiction lore that rewards thinking about it slowly, which makes it perfect for the context of falling asleep. Just let your mind wander through the implications. What is it like to be a Flaxan soldier, to cross over into another dimension, knowing that every moment you spend there is burning through your lifespan at an accelerated rate? To know that the mission requires speed, not just tactically, but biologically. There is something almost tragic about it, a warrior people fighting against entropy itself, using the most dangerous clocks imaginable. And then there is Cecil Stedman. Cecil is the kind of character who is fascinating precisely because the show refuses to make him simply a villain or simply an ally. He is the director of the Global Defense Agency, which is essentially a government organization built around the concept of responding to superhuman and extraterrestrial threats to Earth. Cecil is brilliant. He is paranoid. He is ruthless in exactly the way someone in his position would need to be if they were genuinely trying to protect a planet that keeps getting attacked by beings capable of cracking continents. His relationship with Mark is one of the central tensions of Season 2. Cecil wants to use Mark as an asset. He wants to direct Mark's power towards Cecil's definition of the greatest good for the greatest number, and there is a version of that argument that is almost convincing. Cecil has information Mark does not have. Cecil has context. Cecil has made hard calculations that have, in his accounting, saved more lives than they have cost. But Mark has watched what Cecil's utilitarian calculus looks like in practice, and it looks like things Mark cannot accept. It looks like treating human beings as variables in an equation rather than as people whose inherent dignity matters. The conflict is not cartoonish. Cecil is not wrong about everything. Mark is not naive about everything. They are two different philosophies about how to protect something precious, and the tension between them is genuinely unresolvable in any clean or satisfying way. Let us find our way to Nolan now, because the Nolan-Grayson storyline in Season 2 takes him somewhere unexpected and genuinely moving. After fleeing Earth, Nolan does not go back to the Viltrumite Empire directly. Instead, he finds himself on a planet called Thraxa. And what happens on Thraxa is a window into a question the show has been building towards since its first episode. Can someone like Nolan change? Not just tactically change, not just recalculate his strategy, but actually become something different at the level of values and feeling. On Thraxa, Nolan does something that echoes his time on Earth in ways that are both obvious and worth sitting with. He builds another life. He connects again, on terms that are different from before, but that reflect some of the same impulses, the hunger for genuine relationship, for meaning that is not just conquest. And this second life, this echo, forces the question of whether what happened on Earth was an aberration for Nolan, something that happened to him once, or whether it reveals something more fundamental about who he actually is beneath the Viltrumite conditioning. The answer the show offers is ambiguous in the most interesting way. Nolan is not redeemed in any simple sense. He has done terrible things that cannot be undone. The lives he ended, the damage he caused, those are facts that cannot be revised by whatever growth occurs afterward. But there is something happening in Nolan that is not nothing. And the show seems genuinely uncertain about what to do with that something, which feels true to how we actually understand people who have caused harm and are in some genuine sense trying to become different. His eventual capture by the Viltrumite Empire is where Season 2 begins pulling its threads together. Because a Viltrumite who has gone off mission, who has been compromised by genuine emotional attachment, who refused to carry out the conquest of Earth when the moment arrived, is not just a disappointment to the Empire, he is a problem. He is evidence that the Viltrumite ideology has a vulnerability. That exposure to real relationships and real love can erode the certainty that makes a Viltrumite soldier so effective, and the Empire cannot allow that evidence to propagate. Nolan on trial, Nolan in Viltrumite custody, represents the show engaging with its deepest question. What does justice look like when the perpetrator is also someone you love? What does it look like from Mark's perspective, knowing that his father is being held by an empire that represents everything terrible about the Viltrumite legacy, an empire that also created his father, shaped him, sent him on the mission that ended up defining Mark's entire life? The emotional geography here is impossibly complex, and the show navigates it without pretending the complexity can be resolved. Let us take a moment to breathe with the Guardians of the Globe, because the institutional lore of the superhero community within Invincible's world is its own rich subject. The original Guardians were killed by Omni-Man in the Season 1 premiere, a moment of brutal efficiency that reframed everything the show would do afterward. The new Guardians that form in the wake of that tragedy are a genuinely different kind of team. They are dealing with the institutional trauma of knowing that the most trusted hero in their world committed mass murder against his own colleagues. They are dealing with public relations challenges, with internal trust issues, with the challenge of building cohesion among people who are each carrying their own complicated histories. Amber Bennett's brother, Robot, whose real name and real nature become increasingly significant as the show progresses, is perhaps the most layered figure in the Guardians storyline. Robot is a genius operating within a body that is not his own, using technology to bridge the gap between his actual physical form and the world he inhabits. His relationship with Monster Girl is one of the genuinely tender relationships the show explores in Season 2, complicated by the inverse aging problem that their respective physiologies create. Every time Monster Girl transforms, she loses a bit of time, growing younger rather than older. Robot, who is intimately familiar with the experience of existing in a body that does not match your internal sense of self, brings a particular depth of understanding to that relationship. And then there is the question of what Robot actually wants, not for the team, not for Earth, but for himself. Because Robot is someone with an extraordinary mind and a set of capabilities that go far beyond what any of his colleagues fully understand, and Season 2 begins sketching the outlines of an ambition that will have enormous consequences. Let us move toward the quieter emotional spaces of the season, because the lore of Invincible is not only the cosmic and the catastrophic. It is also the intimate. William Clockwell, Mark's best friend, is a character the show uses with great skill to keep the human scale visible, even as everything around Mark gets larger and more overwhelming. William knows Mark is invincible. Their friendship has survived that revelation and the complicated feelings that came with it, and in Season 2, William's own emotional life, his relationships, his grief, his attempts to build something that feels stable in a world that keeps getting violently destabilized, provides a through line back to the ordinary human experience. There is something the show understands about why someone like Mark needs someone like William when you are the child of a Viltrumite, when you are tangled up in intergalactic politics and fighting beings who can shatter mountains. You need a friend who will sit with you and be ordinary. Who will talk about things that do not matter in the grand scheme of cosmic history? Who will remind you that the grand scheme is not actually the only scale that matters? The Angstrom-Levy storyline is one of the most significant villain arcs in Season 2. Levy is a character whose tragedy is embedded in his origin. He is a man with the ability to open portals to alternate dimensions, a genuinely remarkable power that he has tried to use in service of a humanitarian mission. He wanted to gather knowledge from across the multiverse, to collect the wisdom and the survival strategies of countless alternate versions of human civilization, so that the version he belonged to could benefit from all of that accumulated understanding. The accident that ruins everything, the event that transforms him from a well-intentioned researcher into someone consumed by hatred and obsession, is connected to Invincible in a way that Levy believes, but that is actually more complicated than his grief allows him to see clearly. His body is horribly damaged. His mind becomes a repository of memories from multiple alternate versions of himself, which creates a psychological fragmentation that would be difficult for anyone to hold together, and the emotion that organizes all of that fragmentation, that gives it structure and direction, is rage at Mark Grayson. What makes Levy fascinating as an antagonist is that the show asks you to see the genuine wound underneath the villainy. He is not wrong that his life was destroyed. He is wrong about the clearest moral conclusions he has drawn from that destruction. And his campaign against Mark forces Mark into situations where the show examines something important about heroism, about what you do when someone who has genuinely suffered tries to destroy everything you are trying to protect, when the villain has a real grievance, when the right answer is not a clean one. The multiverse elements the Levy storyline introduces are handled with real care. The alternate dimensions we glimpse through his portals are not just spectacle. Each one is a version of the story we have been watching, bent in a different direction by a different choice or a different event. They serve as reminders that the version of events we are following is not inevitable, that history is contingent, that the characters we have come to care about exist in a particular configuration that could easily have been otherwise. And in that reminder is something that functions almost like comfort, if you let yourself feel it from the right angle. The fact that things could have been different means that what happened was a series of choices, and choices imply that future choices also matter, that the story is not already written, that Mark, who carries such weight, might still find a version of his future that is not determined entirely by the worst things his inheritance contains. The final stretch of Season 2, the convergence of the Viltrumite threat, the consequences of Cecil's methods, the state of Mark's relationships, the question of Nolan's fate, all of it comes together in a way that feels less like a traditional climax and more like an emotional reckoning. The show is not really trying to resolve its central tensions, it is trying to honestly portray what it looks like to live with them, to be someone who cannot fix everything, who cannot unmake the past, who cannot know with certainty whether the choices being made in the present are the right ones. Mark at the end of Season 2 is not victorious in the traditional sense. He is still standing, he is still choosing, as deliberately as he can, to be something other than what the darkest possibilities of his nature might allow. And in the context of everything we have walked through tonight, that choice, the simple, difficult, unfinished, constantly renewed choice to try to be good even when good is unclear and hard and costly, that is where the lore of Invincible Season 2 lives most fully. The universe the show builds, from the Viltrumite Empire to the coalition of planets, from the Sequids to the Flaxans, from Cecil's utilitarian calculus to Debbie's grief, to Eve's molecular miracle and William's ordinary friendship, all of it exists to ask a version of the same question. Given what you come from, given what you are capable of, given what you have already done, and what has already been done to you, who do you choose to be? And Mark keeps choosing imperfectly, with setbacks, with moments of doubt and exhaustion and genuine failure, but choosing. Breathe out slowly. You have traveled a long way tonight. From the streets of a city that keeps getting destroyed and rebuilt, to the courts of an empire that has never known what it means to lose. From a mother drinking too much wine in a house that used to feel like home, to a boy flying alone in the dark, above a world that is counting on him whether he asked for that responsibility or not. Let all of that settle around you now. The lore is not going anywhere. The story will be there when you wake up. The multiverse is patient. The Viltrumite Empire has waited thousands of years. Your pillow is soft. Your breathing is slowing. The questions Mark carries will still be there to carry tomorrow. And somehow, in this particular moment, that fact is not frightening. It is just the shape of an ongoing story. The stars are out there. The cosmos is doing what the cosmos does, vast and indifferent and full of things we do not yet understand. Mark Grayson is up there somewhere, flying above the cloud line, looking down at something he loves and does not fully know how to protect. And you are here, warm, still, letting the weight of the day lift off your chest, like someone finally learned to fly. Sleep well. The Guardians have got the watch tonight. Picture this. It is 3 a.m. You cannot sleep. Your mind is racing, and somewhere in the back of your brain, a thought creeps in. What if there is something about Invincible Season 2 that you completely missed? What if the lore runs so deep, so dark, so genuinely unsettling, that knowing it will either keep you up even longer or finally give your restless mind something worth chewing on until you drift off? Well, tonight, I am going to give you exactly that. So get comfortable. Pull that blanket up. Close your eyes if you want. Because we are going into the lore, and we are going deep. Invincible Season 2 dropped, and it absolutely shattered expectations. But here is the thing about this show that most people miss when they are watching it for the first time. The surface story, the punching and the drama and the blood and the betrayal, that is just the layer you are supposed to see. Underneath all of that is something much more complex, a mythology that has been building for decades inside the comics, carefully adapted and layered into the animated series in ways that are subtle and patient and genuinely kind of haunting when you start to pull on the threads. So tonight, as you settle in, I want to walk you through the shocking lore buried inside Season 2, the things that explain why characters behave the way they do, the ancient histories that give the conflicts their weight, the cosmic implications that make everything feel so much bigger and heavier than a typical superhero story, and I promise you, by the time we reach the end, you will understand this world in a way that makes it feel almost mythological. Let us start with Nolan Grayson, Omni-Man. Because even though Season 1 ended with his departure and his defeat, Season 2 does not let him off the hook. It deepens him in ways that are genuinely uncomfortable to sit with. When we learn more about his history with the Viltrumite Empire, we begin to understand that Nolan was not simply a soldier following orders. He was a true believer. For most of his life, he genuinely, deeply, in his core believed that the Viltrumite way was the correct and superior way to organize civilization. The idea that strength determines worth. The idea that conquest is a form of upliftment. These were not things he was coerced into believing. They were things he was raised with from childhood on a planet where these values were as natural as breathing. And here is where the lore gets disturbing. The Viltrumite Empire did not achieve its dominance through simple military might. They did it through a process that is, when you really think about it, a form of civilizational horror. Entire worlds were not just conquered, they were absorbed. The local populations were evaluated. Those deemed worthy, meaning those who could serve the empire, were integrated. Those deemed unworthy were simply removed, not enslaved, not imprisoned, removed. The Viltrumites have been doing this across the galaxy for thousands of years, and Season 2 begins to pull back the curtain on how many worlds have experienced this fate. Now let your mind drift to that for a moment. Thousands of years, world after world, and Earth, our little blue planet, has been quietly sitting in their sights for decades, with one of their most decorated soldiers living here, watching us, and for a long time, genuinely preparing to hand us over. That is the weight Invincible carries now, not just the personal betrayal of a father, but the cosmic inheritance of being the son of someone who was, for centuries of interstellar history, one of the most effective agents of civilizational destruction in the known universe. Moving now into the sequids, because if you have not given these creatures their proper due, you have been sleeping on one of the most genuinely creepy lore threads in the entire series. The sequids look small. They look almost silly at first glance. But what they represent is a kind of horror that feels very different from the physical violence of the Viltrumites. The Viltrumites conquer through strength. The sequids conquer through replacement. What the sequids do is they do not destroy the mind they inhabit. They do not kill the host. They layer themselves on top of the host's consciousness, using the host's own memories and personality and emotional responses as a kind of camouflage. The person you knew is still technically there, but they are underneath now, and the thing operating their body has access to everything they ever knew, everything they ever felt, everything that made them who they were. And it is using all of that to pass as them. Think about the existential terror of that. Not being killed, not being imprisoned, just being buried inside your own mind while something else lives your life. And Season 2 expands on the threat of the sequids in ways that make it clear they are not just a single planet problem. Their potential as a galactic threat is something the narrative begins to acknowledge, and the lore behind why they evolved this particular survival mechanism is genuinely fascinating if you let it sit with you in the dark. They are survivors. That is the ugly truth about the sequids. They developed this parasitic intelligence as a response to being a vulnerable species on a hostile world. They found the most efficient path to survival, which was not to develop weapons or shields or armies. It was to become invisible by wearing the faces of those who would threaten them. In a galaxy full of Viltrumite-level predators, the sequids found a way to persist. And whether that makes them villains or just organisms doing what organisms do is a question the lore leaves deliberately unanswered. Now let us move into something that does not get talked about nearly enough, which is the Cecil Stedman layer of the lore. Cecil is one of the most morally complex figures in this universe, and Season 2 continues to develop him as someone who operates in the space between necessary evil and genuine monstrousness. But to understand why Cecil is the way he is, you have to understand what the Global Defense Agency actually is within the lore of this world. The GDA is not just a government organization that manages superhero activity. It is, in the context of this fictional world, the Earth's most sophisticated attempt to prepare for exactly the kind of threat that Nolan Grayson represented. Cecil has known, or at least suspected, for years that superhero culture on Earth could be infiltrated at the highest levels. He has been building contingencies and backup plans and morally compromised arrangements for decades because he genuinely believes that without those things, humanity does not survive contact with the larger universe. And here is the lore piece that makes Cecil genuinely tragic rather than simply villainous. He is right. Within the logic of this world, Cecil's willingness to do terrible things has, by his own accounting, saved more lives than the traditional heroic approaches. The horrible arrangements he has made, the morally bankrupt deals he has struck, the secrets he has buried, they have, in the calculus of the story's universe, been effective. The horror is not that Cecil is wrong. The horror is that the universe he lives in seems to confirm his worldview at every turn. That is the kind of moral weight that Invincible Season 2 sits inside, and it is the kind of thing that your mind can quietly turn over in the dark without needing to be actively disturbing. It is philosophically heavy rather than viscerally shocking, and it makes for very good late-night thinking. Let the screen fade for a moment. Let the sounds around you settle, because the next piece of lore I want to bring you into is probably the most cosmically significant thing happening in the background of Season 2, and it involves the Viltrumite population crisis in ways that recontextualize everything. Here is something that the show reveals and then asks you to just carry with you. The Viltrumite Empire, despite its terrifying military dominance, is demographically on the edge of collapse. The empire that has conquered hundreds of worlds and eliminated thousands of civilizations is, in terms of pure numbers, a tiny population. The reason for this comes down to Viltrumite biology and history. A plague, many generations back, nearly wiped them out. And while they survived it, and while the survivors became the almost indestructible beings we know them as today, the population never fully recovered. This means that every single Viltrumite life has enormous strategic value to the Empire. Losing one Viltrumite soldier is not like losing one human soldier in terms of the arithmetic of power. It is a wound to a gene pool that is already stretched thin across a galaxy-spanning empire. And this biological vulnerability, hidden under layers of cultural invincibility and warrior mythology, is the secret crack in the foundation of everything the Viltrumites have built. And it is why Nolan matters so much, and why Mark matters even more. Half-human, half-Viltrumite hybrids may represent something the pure Viltrumites never expected, which is a genetic pathway that actually diversifies and potentially strengthens a dying bloodline. The empire that enslaves worlds to serve Viltrumite supremacy may ultimately depend for its survival on the very mixing of blood it considers inferior. That irony is written into the bones of Season 2's lore, and it is worth sitting with as you drift. Let us go somewhere different now. Let us talk about Angstrom Levy, because his story in Season 2 is not just a villain arc. It is a meditation on perspective and victimhood, and the way trauma can calcify into something monstrous. Angstrom Levy has the ability to open portals to alternate dimensions, and in his backstory, he had a genuine ambition that was, on its surface, not evil. He wanted to absorb the knowledge of alternate versions of himself from across countless parallel realities, to become a repository of accumulated human wisdom. It is almost a beautiful idea if you strip away what went wrong. What went wrong is that Mark, through a chain of events and misunderstandings, contributed to an accident that destroyed Angstrom's plan and left him physically and mentally transformed. And Angstrom Levy, in the calculus of his own experience, is not the villain of his story. He is the victim. He is the man who wanted to do something extraordinary for humanity and had it taken from him by a young, careless superhero who was not even paying full attention. The lore implication here is vast and underexplored in conversations about this show. Angstrom has now traveled through countless alternate realities and has gathered intelligence from versions of the Invincible story, where Mark becomes something much worse. He has seen timelines, he has seen outcomes. And in many of them, Mark Grayson does not stay heroic. In many alternate realities, the version of Invincible that emerges is not the one who resisted his father's legacy, it is the one who inherited it. So when Angstrom comes at Mark with such overwhelming hatred, it is not just personal grievance. It is the accumulated testimony of countless universes whispering that this young man in the superhero suit is dangerous, and the terrifying thing the lore leaves open is whether Angstrom might, in some fundamental way, be processing real information. Now, as your breathing slows and the room feels a little quieter, I want to bring you into the emotional core of Season 2 lore, which is really about legacy and what we inherit, and whether we can escape the gravity of where we come from. Mark Grayson is caught in a position that is genuinely mythological in its structure. He is the son of a god who turned out to be something terrible. In the great mythologies of human civilization, this is a pattern we recognize: the child of the destroyer, the heir to the throne of something monstrous. And across every culture that has told this kind of story, the central question is always the same: does the blood determine the fate? The Viltrumite ideology says yes, absolutely yes. Blood is everything. Lineage is destiny. Strength determines worth, and worth is heritable. That is the universe Nolan grew up in, the philosophy that was embedded in him like code, and it is the philosophy he unconsciously passed along through simply being Mark's father, not through direct teaching, but through the way power was normalized in their home. Through the casual demonstrations of strength, through the unspoken assumption that the Grayson men were exceptional in a way that set them apart. And Mark has to dismantle all of that from the inside, while also being genuinely, physically, almost irresistibly powerful. That is the psychological trap the lore has set for him. The more powerful he becomes, the more Viltrumite he becomes, the stronger the pull of the identity he is trying to reject. And Season 2 watches him navigate that with all the grace and awkwardness and pain of someone who does not have a map. Let me tell you about the Immortal, because his lore connection to the history of Earth adds another layer that I think people underappreciate. The Immortal, as his name suggests, has been alive for an extraordinarily long time. He has watched human civilization rise and develop and expand. He has memory that stretches back through historical eras that most people only know as chapters in books. And what this means within the lore of the Invincible universe is that he represents a kind of institutional memory that no other character can offer. The Immortal remembers what Earth was before the superhero age. He remembers the transition. He carries in his ancient mind a continuity of human experience that gives him a perspective on the current cosmic threats that is both invaluable and deeply melancholy. Because he has seen civilizations fall, he has watched things that seemed permanent dissolve into dust. And now he is watching Earth stand on the edge of something that his centuries of experience tell him may be unsurvivable without extraordinary choices. There is something very quiet and very sad about the immortal when you layer the lore over his appearances in Season 2. He is not optimistic in the way young heroes are. He is determined in the way that survivors are, which is a very different energy. He keeps going, not because he believes everything will be fine. He keeps going because stopping is not something he knows how to do anymore. Now we should spend some time in the dark with the Viltrumite warrior Conquest, because within the lore of the Empire, Conquest represents a specific philosophical position that the show uses almost as a counter-argument to everything Mark believes. Conquest is ancient even by Viltrumite standards. He has fought on more worlds than most Viltrumites have even heard of. He has been injured and has recovered and has come back stronger each time, and that cycle of damage and return has become his identity. He does not fear death. He does not particularly fear pain. What drives him is the pure philosophy of dominance as natural order. In Conquest's worldview, the galaxy is not a collection of civilizations with equal rights to existence. It is an ecosystem, and apex predators are not morally responsible for the existence of prey. This is not a position Conquest holds cynically or even particularly aggressively. It is simply his understanding of how existence works, and that makes him genuinely chilling in a way that purely sadistic villains are not, because you cannot reach him with appeals to empathy or shared humanity. He is not suppressing those things. He simply never had them in the framework he uses to understand the world. His confrontation with Mark in the lore is not just a physical fight. It is an argument. It is the Viltrumite philosophy at its most distilled, going up against whatever Mark has managed to build in opposition to it. And the fact that the fight is so brutal, so grinding, so close to going the other way, is the lore making a point. The argument is not easy to win. The philosophy Conquest represents has thousands of years of empirical success behind it. Defeating it requires more than good intentions. Let your body sink deeper into wherever you are resting right now. Let the sounds of the story wash over you, because I want to take you now into something softer but no less significant, which is the lore around Amber and what she represents in the architecture of Mark's life during Season 2. Amber is often framed in fan discussions as a supporting character, someone in Mark's orbit, rather than a figure with her own lore weight, but I think that fundamentally misreads what the narrative is doing with her. Amber represents the gravitational pull of a normal life. She is not a plot device. She is the lore argument for why any of this is worth fighting for. In a story filled with cosmic empires and ancient warriors and existential threats to civilization, Amber is a young woman who is sharp and principled and does not have superpowers and is choosing to be with someone whose life has become genuinely terrifying. The lore of that choice is actually profound. She is not staying with Mark because the story requires her to. She is staying because she has looked at the chaos and made a conscious decision about what she values. And when that relationship strains under the weight of everything Mark is carrying, it is the story saying something important. The normal life does not wait. The people who anchor us to who we want to be have their own limits, their own needs, their own timelines. And in the broader cosmological lore of Invincible, where civilizations are destroyed and legacies span millennia, the quiet human story of whether two young people can maintain trust under impossible pressure is somehow just as weighty as anything happening between Viltrumites. Now let us drift into the Thraxan chapter of the lore, because what happened on Thraxa during Nolan's time there is one of the more morally complicated pieces of the entire mythology, and Season 2 forces us to look at it directly. Nolan, after leaving Earth, settled on Thraxa. He lived among a species with an extremely short natural lifespan, relatively speaking, and he fell in love and had a child. And the lore implications of this are genuinely strange and uncomfortable when you examine them. Nolan, who spent decades on Earth building a family and preparing to eventually hand the planet over to an empire, who fathered a child he came to genuinely love and then left, went to another world and did a version of the same thing again, faster, because Thraxan life moves faster. But structurally similar. What does that tell us about Nolan Grayson? It tells us that his capacity for attachment is real and is not something that coexists easily with his Viltrumite identity. He is not a creature without feeling. He is a creature with feeling who chose for most of his life to let ideology override it, and who now finds himself, in Season 2, having to confront the wreckage of every place he has loved and left. The half-brother that Mark discovers in this arc is not just a plot twist. It is the lore rhyming with itself. Another child of Nolan, growing up in the shadow of a father who is history in the making and a disaster in the personal. Another inheritance of power and complication. Another heir to the legacy of a man who has never quite figured out how to stay. As the night settles in around you, I want to bring the energy down even further and talk about something the lore of Season 2 handles in the background, which is the question of what heroism actually costs on the cosmic scale of this universe. Most superhero narratives handle the cost of heroism in personal terms. The hero loses relationships, struggles with identity, misses ordinary life, and Invincible does all of that. But it also asks a question that very few superhero stories are willing to sit with, which is whether individual heroism is even the right tool for threats of this size. The Viltrumite Empire is not a villain that can be punched into surrender. It is a civilization. It is a thousands-year-old institutional structure with a culture and a military and a population spread across the galaxy. Stopping it is not a matter of finding the right superhero moment. It requires strategy and alliance building and sacrifice on scales that individual courage cannot reach. And the lore of Season 2 is quietly building toward the acknowledgement that Mark, for all his power and his good heart, cannot solve this the way superhero instincts suggest. That tension between the heroic individual and the scale of the problem is the philosophical engine running underneath all of the action and drama. And it is something that your mind can follow gently down into sleep, turning it over and over like a smooth stone in your hand. Let us touch on the Guardians of the Globe for a moment, because the institutional lore of that team in Season 2 is doing something interesting. The original Guardians were murdered by Omni-Man. The new Guardians are assembled in the wake of that trauma, and what the lore is tracking in Season 2 is the question of whether a team built on the ashes of a betrayal can develop genuine trust. Cecil assembled this team. And Cecil, as we have established, is not a figure who inspires uncomplicated trust. Every member of the New Guardians is operating with a certain awareness that they are, at some level, pieces on Cecil's board, and yet they are also people with their own histories and powers and reasons to fight. The team dynamic in Season 2 is the lore working through the question of whether institutional cynicism and genuine heroism can occupy the same space. The answer the story seems to be reaching toward is complicated and not entirely comforting. Yes, they can coexist, but the coexistence has costs. And the people who pay those costs are usually the ones who brought the genuine heroism to the arrangement. Now I want to bring you somewhere very specific in the lore. I want to talk about the emotional architecture of what the show is doing with Debbie Grayson, Mark's mother, in Season 2. Because her storyline is, in the context of all this cosmic lore, the most human thing the narrative contains, and it is handled with a quietness that I think is easy to underestimate. Debbie spent decades of her life married to a man who was, she eventually learned, an alien spy. Everything she thought she knew about her marriage, her family, the life she built, had a layer of unreality underneath it, and yet the feelings were real. The love was real, or at least the experience of love was real, and the difference between those two things is where Debbie lives in Season 2. The lore question her story asks is genuinely philosophical. If someone loves you genuinely and also deceives you fundamentally, what is the truth of that relationship? Was it love? Was it manipulation? Can it be both? And does the answer change what was real about your own life? These are questions the law does not answer because they cannot be answered. They can only be lived with. And watching Debbie navigate that in Season 2, while the cosmic machinery of Viltrumite empire and interdimensional invasion grinds away around her, is the show at its most honestly human. Her grief is not operatic. It is the quiet, grinding, daily kind, the kind that is there when you wake up and still there when you try to sleep, the kind that becomes a companion you never asked for, and in the context of all the world-ending lore around her, that ordinary human grief is somehow the most devastating thing the show contains. Let the weight of that settle over you like a heavy blanket, like something warm and still. The lore of Invincible Season 2 is ultimately a story about inheritance, about what gets passed down through bloodlines and through cultures and through civilizations. About whether the things we inherit determine us or whether we can choose our way out of them. About whether the universe is fundamentally ordered around power or whether that is just a story powerful things tell to justify their existence. The Viltrumites believe in the inheritance of strength. Cecil believes in the inheritance of institutional knowledge and cold pragmatism. The Sequids believe in the inheritance of survival by any means necessary. Angstrom Levy carries the inherited testimony of infinite alternate histories. The Immortal carries the inherited memory of a civilization's entire arc. Debbie carries the inherited love and grief of a life built on a foundation she did not fully know. And Mark Grayson, floating in the middle of all of it, is trying to figure out what he wants to inherit. From his father, from humanity, from the best version of what a hero could be. He does not have the answer yet. Season 2 is honest about that. He is making it up as he goes, the way all of us do, just with more bruising. There is something almost comforting about that, in the way that honest things are often more comforting than false reassurances. He does not know. He is trying anyway. He gets knocked down and comes back and tries to be better than what made him. That is not a cosmic story. That is a human story. And somehow, wrapped in all this lore about empires and plagues and parasites and ancient warriors, it is the most resonant thing of all. So, as your eyes grow heavy and the details of the lore begin to soften at the edges, let this be the last thing you carry into sleep. Every enormous thing in this universe, every empire and every existential threat and every ancient power, it all began somewhere small. A choice, a belief, a connection between people who were just trying to figure out who they were and what they owed the world. The shocking lore of Invincible Season 2 is full of the enormous and the terrible and the cosmically vast. But underneath all of it, beating quietly at the center, is the same thing that beats at the center of every story worth telling. Something small and ordinary and impossibly fragile trying to survive in a universe that is very large and does not always care. And that, maybe, is the most lore-appropriate way to fall asleep, knowing that the enormous things are real and frightening and worth understanding. And knowing that the small things, the human things, the morning light things, they are still here too, still mattering, still being worth the fight. Close your eyes now. The Empire can wait. The lore will still be there when you wake up. For now, just drift. The story knows where it is going. And so, eventually, will you. Look, I know what you're doing right now. You're lying in bed, blanket pulled up, phone tilted at that exact angle where your arm is going to fall asleep before you do, and you've decided that what you absolutely need right now is someone talking about a superhero show to help you drift off. And honestly, that's the most chaotic and relatable decision a human being can make in 2026. So welcome to the most niche sleep content ever created. Invincible Season 2 lore, explained in a way that is technically educational, but also kind of ridiculous, because the show itself is kind of ridiculous, and we love it for that. Get comfortable. Seriously, adjust your pillow, maybe grab the other blanket. We're going to take a slow, gentle stroll through the absolute mayhem that is Season 2 of Invincible. And by the end of this, either you'll know everything about the show, or you'll be completely unconscious. And both of those outcomes are a win. Now, before we actually dive into Season 2, we need to do a tiny bit of setup, because if you somehow wandered in here without watching the show, I need you to understand the foundation of what we're dealing with. Don't worry, this won't be a frantic recap. This is going to be slow, calm, and slightly absurd because that's the energy we're bringing tonight. Invincible is a show about a teenager named Mark Grayson who discovers he has superpowers. Normal enough, right? Except his dad, Nolan Grayson, who goes by the superhero name Omni-Man, is basically the most powerful being on the planet. He's essentially this universe's version of Superman, except at the end of Season 1, it turns out dear old dad has been secretly working for an alien empire called the Viltrum Empire, and his whole purpose on Earth was to weaken humanity and prepare the planet for conquest. Cool dad stuff. Very normal family dynamics. The Season 1 finale ends with Nolan absolutely destroying Mark in a fight, nearly killing him, having a last-minute change of heart, and then flying off into space to escape the consequences of, trying to help an alien empire enslave humanity. So Season 2 picks up in the aftermath of all that emotional wreckage, and the show does something really interesting. It slows down, it breathes, it lets its characters actually process things. Which sounds boring when I describe it that way, but trust me, it's actually deeply compelling in the way that only a show about a traumatized teenager in a spandex suit can be. So let's talk about what Season 2 is actually doing, thematically and narratively, because this show has layers that are genuinely fascinating to think about as you're drifting off to sleep. Mark Grayson, our boy Invincible, is dealing with something that doesn't get explored nearly enough in superhero stories. He's dealing with the aftermath of parental betrayal, not in a vague, symbolic way, in a very literal, extremely direct way where his father beat him to within an inch of his life, and the show takes that seriously. There's this interesting tension in Season 2 where Mark is trying to figure out his own identity, completely separate from his father. His whole heroic journey in Season 1 was colored by this desire to be like Nolan, to live up to this larger-than-life figure who turned out to be a villain in a very complicated sense of the word. So who is Mark without that North Star? Who is he when the person he was trying to emulate turns out to have been lying his entire life? That's actually a really rich question, and the show handles it in between all the absolutely insane action sequences. Speaking of Nolan, can we just take a moment to appreciate what a wild character he is? Because Nolan Grayson, Omni-Man, is this fascinating contradiction walking around in a mustache. He genuinely loves his family, that's not in question. The emotional beat that saves his soul in the Season 1 finale is him being flooded with memories of his life with Mark, of teaching his son to ride a bike, of being a father, but he also spent decades lying to everyone around him and working toward humanity's subjugation. He holds both of those things simultaneously, and it's uncomfortable, and it's supposed to be uncomfortable. In Season 2, Nolan is off in space, and his storyline gets genuinely strange and entertaining in ways that feel almost comedic if you step back far enough. He ends up on a planet called Thraxa, which is populated by insect-like aliens. Listen, I want you to really sit with this information as you're getting sleepy. Nolan Grayson, the most powerful man on Earth, former Superman stand-in, has gone to an alien planet inhabited by bug people and has started a whole new family. He has another son coming. This is his solution to the events of Season 1. Leave Earth, go live with the bug people, have another kid. It's the most unhinged coping mechanism imaginable, and the show plays it completely straight. Now the Viltrumites, the empire that Nolan was originally working for, they are genuinely terrifying as villains when you look at their whole deal. The Viltrum Empire is built on this philosophy of pure strength and dominance. They believe only the strong deserve to exist, and they travel the universe conquering planets and absorbing their populations. But here's the detail that I find fascinating and a little bit absurd. The Viltrumites actually have very low birth rates. For all their talk about genetic superiority and strength and survival of the fittest, they can barely reproduce, so they actually need half-breeds. They need people like Mark, who are half Viltrumite, half human, to help grow their population. the most powerful conquering race in the universe, needs other people's DNA because they can't manage their own numbers. There's something deeply funny about that if you think about it. The galaxy's most terrifying empire is struggling with demographics. The main Viltrumite threat in Season 2 comes in the form of a character named Anissa, who is sent to find Mark and deliver him a message. And Anissa is a complicated character in ways that the show doesn't fully let you off the hook about. She shows up, she's powerful, she's intimidating, and her introduction makes it very clear that the Viltrumite threat is very real and very close. The confrontation between Anissa and Mark is one of those scenes where you feel the weight of what the show is building toward. But let's drift to some of the other storylines that make Season 2 so rich, because Invincible has always been a show with a lot of plates spinning at once. Cecil Stedman is back, and Cecil is one of those characters who exists in this morally grey space that the show is really comfortable exploring. He runs the Global Defense Agency. He's essentially the shadow government figure who keeps the world safe through means that are not always exactly heroic. Cecil is the guy who will do the terrible thing so that someone like Mark doesn't have to, and he believes in that role completely. He thinks that's what makes him good at his job, and maybe even good at a deeper level. He's wrong, but he's wrong in a way that's entirely understandable. The dynamic between Cecil and Mark is basically the tension between idealism and pragmatism made into a human relationship. Mark wants to believe there's always a right answer that doesn't require compromising your values. Cecil believes that's a luxury that the world simply cannot afford. And neither of them is entirely right, and neither of them is entirely wrong, and the show knows that and refuses to make it simple. That's the kind of storytelling that's actually worth staying awake for, which is inconvenient for us right now, but here we are. Let's talk about William and Rick, because this subplot in Season 2 goes to some places that are genuinely affecting and also kind of wild. Rick Sheridan was Mark's friend who was killed by the Mauler twins back in Season 1. William has been carrying that loss around, and then Rick comes back, except Rick comes back as something different. He's been resurrected and enhanced by a scientist named Dr. Sinclair, who is one of the show's more quietly unnerving villains because he doesn't have a dramatic manifesto. He just wants to make things and doesn't particularly care about the ethical implications of those things. The Rick who comes back is essentially a cyborg. He has his memories, his personality, his feelings for William, but he's also been fundamentally altered, and he struggles with what that means for his identity. Is he still Rick? Is he something new that just has Rick's memories? Where does the human end and the machine begin? The show takes this question seriously and gives it emotional weight. The relationship between William and Rick in Season 2 is actually one of the most quietly beautiful threads in the whole season, tucked in between sequences of superheroes punching each other hard enough to level city blocks. Let's ease into some of the mythology stuff, because Season 2 really starts to expand the cosmic scale of this universe in ways that feel appropriately epic. The Sequids are this alien parasite species that can control minds, and they've been quietly building their presence through a plotline that started back in Season 1. There's a Martian ambassador who got infected, and the situation has been escalating in ways that represent a completely separate threat from the Viltrumites. So Mark is dealing with family trauma, an alien empire that wants to absorb Earth, and also a mind-controlling parasite situation on Mars. Tuesday, basically. The Guardians of the Globe, which is basically this universe's version of the Justice League, are trying to rebuild and figure out their place in a world that knows superheroes are fallible and sometimes secretly working for alien empires. The aftermath of Omni-Man's betrayal has changed public perception of heroes in ways that the show explores throughout the season. People are scared, people are skeptical, and the heroes have to do their jobs in an atmosphere where trust is genuinely fragile. That's a really interesting backdrop for superhero storytelling that doesn't get explored enough in the genre. Amber, Mark's girlfriend, gets more to do in Season 2, and I appreciate the show giving her more agency and more complexity. Their relationship is strained by all the things that superhero relationships are always strained by: the secrecy, the danger, the way Mark's life constantly explodes into chaos, but also by some genuinely human stuff. Amber is a person with her own ambitions and her own sense of self, and she doesn't want to just be the girlfriend who waits at home. The show is at least trying to give her a complete identity, which is more than a lot of superhero narratives manage. Now here's something I love about Invincible Season 2 from a pure storytelling craft perspective, and this is the kind of thing that's interesting to think about with your eyes closed. The pacing of the season is deliberately uneven in a way that's actually intentional. Some episodes are almost meditative in how slow they move. They're really digging into character psychology and letting conversations breathe, and then other episodes are absolutely relentless. The show is doing this thing where it's training you to feel the weight of the calm moments because you know what's coming, and the chaos lands harder because you've been in the quiet with these characters. This is emotionally sophisticated for an animated superhero show. Most superhero content, whether animated or live action, doesn't trust its audience enough to sit in the slow moments. Invincible trusts you. It assumes you care about these people, and because of that assumption, you actually do care about them more. The fight choreography in Season 2 is doing something that I think deserves more discussion. The fights in this show are not fun. That's a deliberate artistic choice. When superheroes fight each other, or fight villains in Invincible, it looks and feels like it hurts. The animation style gets almost chaotic and ugly during combat. Blood is present in quantities that would make most superhero content flinch. This is the show saying, loudly and clearly, that violence has consequences, that power used destructively is genuinely destructive, and that there is no clean victory when people capable of leveling cities are trying to hurt each other. That philosophy ties back to something really interesting about the Viltrumite worldview. The Empire glorifies combat and strength, but the show consistently shows us the cost of that worldview. Every fight with a Viltrumite leaves devastation behind. Mark wins fights, and the aftermath looks like a disaster zone. The show refuses to let you feel good about the violence even when the right side wins, and that discomfort is actually doing something thematically important. Let me tell you about the multiverse stuff, because Season 2 starts pulling at those threads in ways that connect to larger lore that the comics established. The Invincible universe has a whole thing with parallel dimensions and alternate versions of characters, and the show begins to hint at those larger implications. There are versions of Mark across different timelines and universes who have made very different choices and become very different people. Some of them are much darker than our Mark. Some of them are cautionary tales about what happens when power meets despair. The implication that our Mark exists on a spectrum of possible Marks is both philosophically interesting and also serves as a quiet threat. This version of him isn't inevitable. His goodness is a choice, and that choice has to be made again and again under pressure. This connects to one of the show's deepest themes, which is nature versus nurture in the most literal possible application. Mark has Viltrumite DNA. He comes from a culture built on conquest and dominance. His father turned out to be exactly what that background would predict. But Mark keeps choosing differently. He keeps choosing to be human in the most meaningful sense, not biologically, he's half alien, but in the sense of caring about people, in the sense of refusing to see strength as justification for harm. The show is arguing that we are not determined by what we come from, we are determined by what we keep choosing. That's actually a really hopeful message wrapped in a show where people get their arms ripped off with some regularity. Angstrom Levy is one of the major antagonists of Season 2, and his whole deal is a masterclass in villain construction, because you can actually understand where he's coming from, even as he becomes a genuine threat. Angstrom has the ability to travel between dimensions and access the knowledge and experiences of parallel worlds. He's been gathering himself, in a sense, collecting understanding from across realities. He wants to use that knowledge to help people, specifically people who have suffered. His motivation is not evil. His methodology becomes monstrous. The gap between good intentions and terrible outcomes is something the show finds endlessly interesting, and Angstrom is one of its best explorations of that gap. His animosity toward Mark is rooted in a genuinely unfair sequence of events, where Mark ends up causing significant damage to Angstrom even while trying to help. And Angstrom, rather than processing that through any framework of forgiveness or understanding, falls into obsession. He makes Mark the source of all his suffering in a psychological move that is deeply human and deeply tragic. He's not wrong that Mark hurt him. He's catastrophically wrong about what that means and what it justifies. Now let's take a slower breath and talk about Debbie Grayson, because Debbie is arguably the most emotionally devastating character in the whole series, and she's not even a superhero. She's just a woman who spent over 20 years married to someone who turned out to be a fundamentally different person than she thought. Think about what that does to someone. Everything she remembers about her marriage is now uncertain. Was any of it real? Did Nolan actually love her, or was she just part of his cover? The love she felt was absolutely real, but what was he feeling? Can she trust her own memories? Can she trust her own judgment? Season 2 spends real time with Debbie, and it lets her be messy and angry and complicated rather than just sad. She drinks too much. She makes choices that aren't great. She's figuring out who she is when the architecture of her life has collapsed. And the show treats that with enormous respect and honesty. Debbie Grayson going through the stages of grief and identity reconstruction in the middle of a show about alien empires and superhero fights is somehow one of the most grounded and realistic depictions of emotional devastation in recent animation. The Monster Girl storyline in Season 2 is something that deserves its own dedicated appreciation. Monster Girl, whose real name is Annie, has a curse that causes her to get younger every time she transforms into her monstrous combat form. She's been fighting this thing for years and getting physically younger while being emotionally and psychologically older. She and Rexplode end up in a dimension called the Flaxen Dimension, where time moves at an accelerated rate. What feels like a short time in the regular world is years and years in the Flaxen Dimension. So Monster Girl and Rex end up living out an entire extended chapter of their lives in this other dimension, while barely any time passes back home. This storyline is doing something really poignant about time and about the ways that shared experience bonds people. Monster Girl and Rex are not people who would have chosen each other. They have friction and history, but surviving together across years in an alien dimension creates something that neither of them could have manufactured under normal circumstances. Their relationship becomes one of the more genuinely earned emotional connections in the season. Let me just gently lay out where the cosmic stakes are heading, because Season 2 is clearly building towards something enormous. The Viltrum Empire is not a threat that can be punched away. They are not a villain with a plan that can be foiled. They are a civilization, an entire way of organizing intelligence and power that has been operating for thousands of years. Taking them on means not just fighting powerful individuals, but confronting an ideology that has spread across countless worlds. Mark cannot win this by himself. Mark probably cannot win this with all the help Earth has to offer, and the show knows that and wants you to feel the weight of that impossibility. The Coalition of Planets, which is basically an alliance of worlds that have resisted Viltrumite conquest, becomes more prominent in Season 2 and beyond. The idea that Mark might be part of something larger than Earth's defense, that he might be a figure in a genuinely cosmic-scale conflict, starts to become more real, and the show handles that scale increase without losing sight of the personal stakes. It never stops being about Mark and his family and his choices. It just keeps widening the frame around those personal stakes. There's a scene in Season 2 that I keep thinking about, and I'll describe it in a way that's peaceful to imagine. Mark is flying, alone, over the ocean, just suspended in the air above water, that goes on forever in every direction. He's not going anywhere at that moment. He's just up there, in between crises, in between responsibilities, just being in the air. It's a quiet moment in a noisy season, and it captures something essential about what it might actually feel like to have these powers. Not the fighting and the saving and the impossible decisions, just the ability to be above everything for a moment. To breathe, to float. This is actually a good image to carry with you as you're getting sleepy. Just imagine being up there. The air is cool at that altitude, The water below is this deep blue-green, moving in slow patterns that are only visible from up high. There's no sound except wind. You're not falling, you're not flying urgently toward anything, you're just suspended, held up by something you don't entirely understand. The clouds are at your level, and occasionally one drifts through you, and it's cold and damp, and then it's gone. And below, the world is going on without needing anything from you just for this moment. Everything can wait. The universe with all its empires and parasites and complicated fathers can just wait. Now, the thing that makes Invincible Season 2 genuinely great, rather than just competently made, is the way it handles the question of heroism without the safety net of easy answers. Most superhero content has this implicit promise. There is a right answer, there is a heroic action, and if you're a good person with good intentions, you'll find it. Invincible refuses that comfort. Mark does good things and people still get hurt. Mark makes the right choices, and the outcomes are still messy. The show is saying something true about real moral life, which is that doing the right thing doesn't guarantee good outcomes. What it guarantees is that you can look at yourself and know you tried to be a certain kind of person. That's actually the argument the show is making about why heroism matters even when it doesn't work. Not because heroes always win, not because goodness is always rewarded, but because the commitment to being that kind of person has value in itself. Mark keeps getting back up, not because he knows he'll succeed, but because not getting back up would mean becoming something he doesn't want to be. And honestly, there's something about that applies way beyond superhero stories. There's something about that applies to any person trying to do the right thing in circumstances that are harder than they should be, which is most of us, most of the time. Getting back up because not getting back up means becoming something you don't want to be. That's a principle that works whether or not you have Viltrumite DNA. The humor in Season 2, because let's return to the lighter notes for a moment, is often in the contrast between the cosmic stakes and the extremely mundane. Mark has to balance being potentially the most important being on the planet, the half-alien son of a Viltrumite warrior who might be key to the fate of Earth, with being a college-aged kid who still has to figure out what he's doing with his life. He's dealing with alien empires, and also, like, what his major is going to be. He's fighting interdimensional villains and also worrying about whether his relationships are okay. The show finds this contrast genuinely funny without being dismissive about it. There's something universally relatable about that gap between the magnitude of what's being asked of you and the very ordinary version of yourself that has to do the asking. Mark Grayson is not particularly special on the inside. He's not a genius or a naturally born leader or a person with unusual wisdom. He's a reasonably nice kid who is being asked to do extraordinary things on a daily basis and is mostly figuring it out as he goes. That's actually the most relatable superhero premise possible. The animation in Season 2 deserves a mention because it's doing a lot of visual storytelling that you might not consciously register, but that your brain is absolutely picking up. The color palette shifts between storylines in ways that communicate the emotional temperature of different narrative threads. The Viltrumite sequences tend toward these cold blues and grays that feel clinical and harsh. The domestic scenes with Debbie have warmer, more golden tones that make the loss feel more acute because the warmth is still there even as everything has fallen apart. Cecil's world lives in these shadowy greens and blacks that feel appropriately murky for a man whose whole existence is operating in moral gray zones. This is craft that you can appreciate in a half-asleep state because it's working below the level of conscious analysis. It's just making you feel things without requiring you to actively think about why. The show's treatment of trauma is consistent throughout Season 2 in ways that I find really thoughtful. Nobody heals on a television timeline in this show. Mark is not over his father's betrayal. Debbie is not over her marriage collapsing. The people who got hurt in the Season 1 finale are not recovered. Things take time, things leave marks, and the characters carry those marks visibly in their behavior and their relationships and their decisions. The show trusts you to understand that trauma is not a plot point that gets resolved, it's something that becomes part of who you are. As we come to the quieter end of this journey through Season 2, let me tell you what the season is ultimately doing as a complete piece of storytelling. It's a season about inheritance, about what we receive from those who came before us, and what we choose to pass forward. Mark has inherited power from his father. He's also inherited the moral weight of what that power has done. He gets to choose what that inheritance means. He gets to decide whether being Nolan's son defines him or whether his own choices define him. And the answer the show gives, slowly and carefully, and across many episodes, is that we define ourselves through accumulated choosing, one decision at a time, one moment of getting back up at a time. That's actually a pretty good thought to carry into sleep, the idea that you are the sum of your choices more than the sum of what you were handed, that every day is another opportunity to be the version of yourself you're trying to be. That even if yesterday was a Viltrumite punching you into a building kind of day, metaphorically speaking, today you can get back up and be Mark Grayson again. So let your breathing slow down now. Let the images settle. Maybe you're thinking about Mark flying over the ocean. Maybe you're thinking about Debbie figuring out who she is in a living room that doesn't feel like hers anymore. Maybe you're thinking about William and Rick sitting together and just being grateful for the improbable fact of each other. Maybe you're thinking about the Viltrum Empire somewhere out in space, inscrutable and enormous, and how the appropriate response to enormous impossible things is just to take them one choice at a time. Whatever you're thinking about, let it get softer at the edges. Let the details blur a little. You don't need to hold any of this tightly. It's all just story, and story can be put down gently when it's time. The show will still be there. Mark will still be out there somewhere in the animated sky, figuring it out as he goes, choosing to be good one more time even when it's hard. And you can be here, horizontal, comfortable, drifting toward whatever version of rest your brain has decided you've earned tonight. Sleep well, dream of flying over oceans that go on forever, dream of cool air and blue-green water, and the quiet that exists between one impossible thing and the next. You wake up at 3 a.m., you can't sleep, and somehow, impossibly, that's actually perfect for what I'm about to tell you, because the lore hiding underneath Invincible Season 3 is the kind of stuff that keeps people up at night, even when they're trying their hardest not to think about it. So get comfortable, turn down the lights, and let me walk you through everything. Invincible Season 3 dropped, and the internet absolutely lost its mind. But here's the thing that most people missed, while they were busy reacting to the surface-level moments. The punches, the blood, the screaming. The real story is happening in the background. The real lore is buried in the details, the implications, the things the show is setting up that most casual viewers completely overlooked. Tonight, we're going deep, and by the time you drift off, your brain is going to be quietly processing some of the most fascinating world-building in modern animation. Let's start with something that I genuinely think is underappreciated. The entire premise of Invincible, the thing that makes it fundamentally different from every other superhero story, is that it's a show about the cost of power, not the acquisition of power, not the celebration of power, the cost. Every single season has been about Mark Grayson slowly learning that being a superhero doesn't feel the way comic books told you it would feel. Season 1 was about discovering your father is a monster. Season 2 was about discovering that monstrousness isn't simple. Season 3 is about something even more complicated. It's about legacy. What do you do when the thing you were built to become is something you actively despise? Nolan Grayson, Omni-Man, is one of the most fascinating characters in the history of superhero fiction, and I want to spend a little time on why before we get into the Season 3 specifics. Because understanding Nolan is the key to understanding almost everything Season 3 is doing. He was sent to Earth with a mission he believed in completely, a mission that required him to view every human being on the planet as something less than fully real, less than worth protecting for their own sake. And then he built a life here, a real one. He had a son, he had a wife, he had 20 years of mundane human experience, and it changed him in ways he couldn't have predicted. The tragedy of Nolan Grayson is that he became human before he even realized it was happening, and then he had to reckon with what that meant. Season 3 continues to grapple with that reckoning, and one of the most quietly devastating pieces of lore that the season is working with involves the Viltrumite Empire itself, because the show has been slowly revealing something uncomfortable. The Viltrumite Empire isn't just powerful, it isn't just ruthless, it's also, in a horrible way, efficient. The way they expand, the way they absorb civilizations, the way they integrate conquered worlds into their structure, it actually works. The planets that survive Viltrumite conquest do tend to become more stable over time. That's the insidious part of the lore. The argument for Omni-Man's mission isn't just naked brutality, there's a logic to it. A horrible, cold, utilitarian logic. And Season 3 makes you sit with that discomfort, rather than letting you off the hook. Mark Grayson is aware of this now. That awareness is what makes his position so agonizing. He's fighting against an empire that his own biology makes him uniquely suited to serve. Every time he gets stronger, every time he pushes his limits, every time he survives something that should have killed him, he's becoming more Viltrumite. The irony is baked into his DNA. Now let's talk about the Sequids, because I feel like this storyline gets undersold in fan discussions and it deserves a lot more attention. The Sequids are a parasitic species that use hosts as vessels for a kind of hive consciousness. And what makes them genuinely terrifying from a lore perspective isn't the body horror, though that's certainly there. What makes them terrifying is what they represent philosophically within the world of Invincible. The Sequids are a dark mirror to the Viltrumite Empire. Both involve the subjugation of individual will to a larger collective purpose, both spread through conquest and absorption. The difference is that the Viltrumites believe they're elevating the civilizations they conquer. The Sequids don't even bother with that pretense. They simply take. The show is drawing a comparison there, whether it says so explicitly or not. The Sequid storyline also has implications for the broader question of what consciousness even means in this universe. When a Sequid takes a host, is the original person still in there somewhere? Is there a version of consciousness that persists even under that kind of control? The show doesn't give you easy answers, and that's part of what makes it such rich material to think about as you're drifting off to sleep. Cecil Stedman. Let's spend some time with Cecil, because he's one of the most morally complex figures in the entire show, and Season 3 continues to develop him in ways that are genuinely interesting. Cecil operates from a utilitarian framework, so extreme that it becomes almost indistinguishable from villainy. He will sacrifice individuals, relationships, and ethical principles without hesitation if he believes the outcome justifies it. And here's the uncomfortable thing. He's usually right. Not morally right, but strategically right. His calculations about threat levels, about necessary sacrifices, about the acceptable costs of keeping Earth safe, they tend to pan out. Cecil is what happens when competence and moral flexibility combine with genuine patriotism and genuine fear. He actually cares about humanity. He's just willing to do things to protect humanity that most humans would find unforgivable. The lore question that Season 3 is really asking about Cecil is this. At what point does protecting something destroy the thing you were protecting? At what point does the means corrupt the end so thoroughly that victory becomes meaningless? There's also something fascinating happening with the Global Defense Agency itself as an institution. The GDA is essentially a shadow government operating on a global scale with essentially no democratic accountability. Cecil reports to who exactly? The show is deliberately vague about this. There are oversight structures nominally, but Cecil clearly operates well outside any meaningful constraints. The GDA is a post-superhero institution. It exists because traditional governments simply aren't equipped to handle the kinds of threats that exist in this world. But its existence also represents a kind of slow erosion of the normal structures of power, and Season 3 is quietly asking whether that's sustainable. Whether the solution to the problem might eventually become a problem in its own right. Amber, Eve, the women in Mark's life. I want to talk about them because the show has been doing something interesting with the female characters that doesn't always get the attention it deserves. Eve's powers are genuinely extraordinary from a lore standpoint. She can rearrange matter at a molecular level. She can create and destroy mass. She can theoretically do things that would reshape civilization if she chose to use her abilities at full scale. And the show is aware of this. There are moments where the camera lingers on what Eve is capable of in a way that suggests the narrative knows it's holding back something enormous. Season 3 continues that trajectory. Eve is becoming more powerful and more conscious of her power simultaneously. The question the lore is building toward is whether the kind of person Eve is, someone fundamentally oriented toward care and toward fixing things, can survive becoming that powerful without losing herself. Amber's role is different, but equally important for what it tells us about the world building. Amber represents the ordinary human perspective, not in a dismissive way, in a crucial structural way. She's the reminder that there is a world of regular people who wake up every morning and go to sleep every night, in a world where beings capable of leveling cities exist and mostly try to function as people. The psychological reality of that is something the show takes seriously. What does it do to you to love someone who is fundamentally not like you, who operates under different physical laws, who faces dangers that you can't share and can't protect them from? Amber's storyline has always been about that gap. Season 3 continues to explore it. Now, I want to talk about something that I think is one of the most fascinating pieces of background lore in the entire Invincible universe: the Flaxans. You remember the Flaxans? They're the dimension-hopping invaders from early in Season 1 who aged rapidly when they entered our dimension. They showed up, they were terrifying, and then they turned into dust and went away. But here's what's interesting. They figured it out eventually. They developed technology to compensate for the aging effect, and now they're a serious threat again. What's fascinating about the Flaxan lore is what it tells you about the nature of the threats in this universe. They don't go away, they adapt. The problems that seem solved in Episode 3 of Season 1 come back in Season 3 as more sophisticated, more dangerous, more prepared versions of themselves. The Invincible universe doesn't let you have clean victories. Every win comes with an asterisk. Let's shift gears and talk about the multiverse elements, because Season 3 leans into this in a way that has massive implications for the lore. The existence of alternate dimensions, alternate versions of Mark Grayson, alternate histories. This isn't just a cool narrative device. It's a philosophical position the show is taking about identity and choice. If there are infinite versions of Mark Grayson, some of whom made different choices and became different people, what does that say about the choices this Mark has made? Are his values something fundamental to who he is, or are they the product of specific circumstances? If slightly different circumstances had produced a different Mark, a darker Mark, a Mark who leaned into his Viltrumite heritage, is that still him? The multiverse lore in Invincible is doing real philosophical work. It's not just spectacle. Angstrom Levy is the character who most embodies the multiverse themes, and his backstory is one of the most genuinely tragic in the show. He's a man who wanted, sincerely and genuinely, to help people. He wanted to use his dimensional travel abilities to absorb the knowledge of alternate universes and deploy that knowledge to improve life on Earth. His intentions were real, and then an accident turned him into a monster, literally and figuratively. Season 3 continues to deal with the fallout of what happened with Levy and what it represents. Because Levy is a cautionary tale about the gap between intention and outcome, about how the desire to do good, pursued without sufficient humility, without sufficient awareness of what could go wrong, can produce catastrophic results. He's a villain created by his own good intentions. That's genuinely haunting. Robot. Let me tell you about Robot, because the Robot storyline is one that I think reveals something deeply unsettling about the world of Invincible that the show only gradually makes explicit. Robot started as what seemed like a straightforward tech genius hero character. Cerebral, strategic, perhaps a bit cold, but fundamentally on the side of good. And then the layers started peeling back. Robot, whose real name is Rudyard Connor, was born with a condition that made his natural body nearly uninhabitable. He operated remotely, through robotic avatars, for years. And when he finally secured a healthy body, something shifted in him, The show suggests, without being completely explicit about it, that the experience of operating through proxies for so long, of never being fully present in your own flesh, did something to his relationship with other people, made them feel less real, made their suffering register differently. Season 3 continues to explore the consequences of his decisions and what they reveal about how power operates when it's divorced from accountability and from genuine human connection. The Teen Team storyline, which has been running in the background of all 3 seasons, is also doing something interesting from a lore perspective. These are young people who have been placed into violent, life-threatening situations because of abilities they didn't choose to have. The show is quietly consistent in its awareness that this is not normal or healthy. The adults in the room, Cecil most of all, use young heroes instrumentally, their assets to be deployed. The psychological damage this causes is something Season 3 is beginning to reckon with more directly. And that reckoning is interesting because it asks a genuinely difficult question. In a world where threats exist at the scale they exist in Invincible, is it actually ethical to sideline capable people just because they're young? Is the calculus different when the stakes are planetary? The show doesn't answer that question easily, and it shouldn't. Donald Ferguson. If you haven't been paying attention to the Donald Ferguson subplot, you've been missing something. Donald is Cecil's closest associate, a man who has served the GDA with complete loyalty for years. And the revelation about what Donald actually is, what Cecil did to preserve him, is one of the most quietly devastating pieces of lore in the show, because it raises the question of what loyalty means, what you owe someone who has served you faithfully, whether the person who wakes up after that kind of intervention is really the same person who went in. Donald doesn't know the full truth about himself, and watching him operate in Season 3 with that gap in his self-knowledge is deeply uncomfortable in the best possible way. Let me talk about Atom Eve's relationship to the broader political economy of the Invincible world. Because this is something I find genuinely fascinating. Eve has the power to end scarcity. Literally. She can create resources from nothing, or close enough to nothing that the difference is academic. She could, in theory, solve poverty. Not ameliorate it. Solve it. And the show is aware of the implications of this. The reason she can't just do that, the reason the world doesn't simply reorganize around her abilities, has to do with systems, political systems, economic systems, the structures of power and interest that resist even beneficial change, because change threatens the position of those who currently benefit from the arrangement. Season 3 touches on this tension. It's lore that has real-world resonance, and that's part of what makes Invincible more than just a superhero show. The coalition of planets deserves more attention than it typically gets in fan discussions. The coalition is an alliance of worlds that have banded together specifically in opposition to Viltrumite expansion. They're not a clean good guys organization. They have their own political complications, their own internal tensions, their own history of difficult decisions, but they represent something genuinely important in the lore. They represent the possibility of collective resistance, the idea that individual worlds, none of which could stand against the Viltrumite Empire alone, might together build something capable of pushing back. Season 3 develops the coalition storyline in ways that have significant implications for where the show is headed. Alan the Alien, who is the coalition's most prominent figure in Mark's experience of the larger universe, is one of the great unsung characters of the show. His arc from largely comedic figure to genuine lore heavyweight has been one of the more satisfying character journeys. Alan knows things about the state of the conflict with the Viltrumites that Mark doesn't, and there are moments in Season 3 where you see Alan making calculations, weighing information, deciding what to share and what to hold back. He's not just a friend, he's an agent of a larger political structure with its own priorities. And sometimes those priorities and Mark's priorities align, and sometimes they don't. I want to spend a few minutes on the thematic architecture of Season 3 specifically, because I think understanding what the season is doing thematically helps you appreciate the lore choices it makes. Season 3 is fundamentally about inheritance, about what we pass down and what gets passed down to us without our consent. Mark is inheriting Nolan's legacy, his power, his reputation, his complicated position in both the Viltrumite Empire and human society. Debbie is inheriting the aftermath of a marriage built on a lie. The heroes of the GDA are inheriting a world shaped by decisions they didn't make and weren't consulted about. The season keeps returning to this question. What do you do with a legacy that is both genuinely valuable and genuinely compromised? Can you take the parts that help you and set aside the parts that harm you? Or are they too deeply entangled to separate? The Viltrumite homeworld lore is something Season 3 expands on, and it's worth dwelling on. Viltrum is a civilization that achieved its current form through internal purging as much as external conquest. The Viltrumites killed the weak among themselves. They selected aggressively for strength over generations. Their empire isn't just the result of superior power, it's the result of a philosophical commitment to the idea that strength is the only value that ultimately matters. And the interesting lore question is what that does to a civilization over the long term. What do you lose when you eliminate everything that isn't strength? The Viltrumites are powerful, and they are, in many ways, broken. Season 3 continues to develop the ways in which their civilization carries the trauma of what it did to itself in order to become what it is. Thrag, as the embodiment of Viltrumite values taken to their purest extreme, is one of the most genuinely frightening characters in the show, not because of his power level, though that's staggering, but because of his consistency. Thrag has never wavered. He has never doubted. He has pursued the Viltrumite mission with absolute clarity and absolute commitment for his entire existence. In a show full of characters struggling with ambivalence and complexity, Thrag's certainty makes him feel almost alien in a deeper sense than his biology. He's frightening because he represents what it looks like when you remove all the internal conflict, all the questioning, all the doubt. What remains is something that looks like conviction, but functions like a weapon. Mark's relationship with his own violence is one of the most consistent and interesting threads running through all 3 seasons. He hits hard, he has always hit hard, and the show never lets him be comfortable with that. There are moments in Season 3 where Mark does what needs to be done, and the camera doesn't look away, and the show doesn't offer him absolution. He carries those moments. They accumulate. The lore question here is about what happens to someone who does necessary violence over a long career of doing necessary violence. How do you stay human? How do you stay the person you were before you had to do things that person couldn't have imagined? The city of Chicago, and what happened to it in Season 1, continues to echo through the narrative in ways that are easy to miss but important. The Omni-Man fight destroyed a significant portion of one of America's largest cities. People died. Thousands of people. The world knows what happened. They don't know exactly why. The full truth of what Nolan was doing was managed and suppressed to some extent. But they know that a superhero fight caused catastrophic destruction. The social and political aftermath of that event is lore that Season 3 continues to build on. How does a society process that? How does it change the relationship between the public and the superhero community? How does it shape policy, politics, culture? Let's come back to Mark for a moment, because I want to talk about something specific. Mark's friendship with William and Rick, and the way ordinary human relationships function in his life, is not just character texture. It's load-bearing lore, because those friendships are the reason Mark doesn't lose himself. They're the tether. When you're capable of what Mark is capable of, when you can fly into orbit and hit something hard enough to crack mountains, the thing that keeps you oriented to human values is human relationships. Season 3 understands this. The domestic scenes, the quiet moments, the conversations that have nothing to do with superheroes, those aren't filler. They're the argument the show is making about what being human actually means. Debbie Grayson deserves an entire video to herself, but let me say something about what her storyline contributes to the lore of Season 3. Debbie is living with the knowledge that her entire adult life was, in part, a construction, that the man she built everything with had a secret so enormous that it retroactively changes the meaning of everything. But here's what's interesting. Not everything is retroactively changed. Some of it was real. Nolan genuinely changed. He genuinely loved his family in ways he hadn't anticipated. The complication for Debbie is that both things are true simultaneously. She was deceived and she was loved. And season 3 doesn't give her an easy way through that. It just gives her the work of living with it. Now let me settle in and talk about something that might be the most interesting long-form lore thread running through the show. The question of what Earth actually is in the context of the larger universe. Humans without any enhancement are not a significant presence on the cosmic stage. They're fragile, short-lived, limited in what they can do and where they can go. But Earth keeps producing enhanced individuals. It keeps drawing the attention of larger powers. It keeps mattering in ways that are disproportionate to its actual population or resources. The Viltrumite Empire wanted it. Multiple other civilizations have targeted it. The Coalition finds it strategically interesting. Why? Season 3 doesn't answer this question fully, but it continues to develop it. There's something about Earth's specific position, geographically, historically, in terms of the individuals it keeps producing, that makes it a hinge point for larger events. The lore is building toward an answer, and the answer, when it comes, is going to reframe a lot of what you've already watched. The role of the Guardians of the Globe, both the original team and the successive versions, is interesting lore-wise because of what they represent institutionally. The Guardians are essentially a public mythology. They exist not just to fight threats, but to give humanity a story about itself. A story about human capability and human resilience, the fact that the original team was murdered, the fact that the institution itself has been rebuilt multiple times, the fact that it's now populated largely by people who didn't make the choices that put them there, but inherited the role. All of that feeds into Season 3's inheritance themes. What do you do with an institution that is essential to public morale, but that has a dark and compromised history that the public doesn't fully know? I want to close by talking about something that I think is the emotional core of everything Season 3 is doing. Mark Grayson is a person who is becoming genuinely extraordinary, more powerful, more experienced, more aware of the actual scale of the universe and his place in it, and that process of becoming is lonely in a way the show captures with real emotional honesty. The further you go beyond human limits, the harder it becomes to live within human scale. The things that matter to you, the things that ground you, start to feel both more precious and more fragile. You can see the end of things more clearly when you're capable of what Mark is capable of. You know better than anyone how quickly things can change, how completely a moment can become the last moment. That's what keeps Mark fighting, not ambition, not destiny, not obligation to some abstract idea of heroism. He's fighting because he knows what's at stake, and he's chosen, against every instinct of pure self-preservation, to put himself between the people he loves and the things that would hurt them. Season 3 is the season where that choice starts to feel like it might cost more than he can afford to pay. And that's the lore that's really underneath all of it, under the Viltrumite history and the multiverse theory and the political machinations of the GDA. It's about a kid from a suburb of Chicago who found out his dad was a monster and decided, deliberately and with full knowledge of the cost, to try to be something different, something better. In a universe that keeps telling him strength is the only thing that matters, Mark Grayson keeps insisting that kindness matters, that love matters, that the people you protect are worth protecting, not because of what they can do, but because of who they are. That's a genuinely radical position in the world of Invincible, and Season 3 makes it feel hard-won in a way that earlier seasons couldn't quite manage because we hadn't spent enough time with him. Now we have. Now we know him well enough to understand what it costs him to keep being that person. And we keep watching because we need to know if he can hold on to it. Close your eyes now. Let all of that settle. The Viltrumite Empire and its cold logic. Cecil Stedman and his terrible calculations, Eve and the impossible scope of what she could become, Alan the alien carrying knowledge he hasn't shared, Thrag and his frightening certainty, Mark Grayson, somewhere between two worlds, fighting to stay human. The lore will be here when you wake up, and so will he, still fighting, still choosing, every single time, to be something better than what he was built to be. Sleep well. Have you ever tried to fall asleep while your brain keeps replaying one of the most brutal twists in animated television history? Yeah, me too. Tonight, we are going to fix that. Welcome to a deep dive into the hidden lore, the background details, the forgotten secrets, and the quietly devastating world building of Invincible Season 1, all delivered in the most relaxing way possible. So get comfortable, pull your blanket up, close your eyes if you want, and let your mind drift through one of the most richly constructed fictional universes ever put to animation. I am going to be your guide through all of it, and I promise you by the end of this, you will have drifted off into a genuinely satisfying sleep. Let us start at the very beginning, not with Mark Grayson putting on his costume for the first time, but with the quiet world that exists underneath all the action. The show is set in a version of Earth that is almost identical to ours, except for one important difference. Superheroes have been publicly active for years. The Guardians of the Globe, the premier superhero team of this world, have been operating long enough that regular people are mostly used to the concept. There are news segments about superhero battles. There is government oversight. There are insurance companies that probably have very specific clauses about property damage caused by beings with heat vision. It is a world that has absorbed the existence of superpowers into everyday life, and that texture, that mundane familiarity with the extraordinary, is one of the most underrated pieces of world building in the entire season. Cecil Stedman and the Global Defense Agency operate behind all of this. The GDA is essentially a secret government organization that monitors, supports, and when necessary contains superhero activity. Cecil is its director, and he is one of the most fascinating characters in the entire season, precisely because he occupies this morally grey space that most shows would not bother constructing. He genuinely cares about protecting humanity. He is also genuinely willing to do things that would make most people deeply uncomfortable. He has contingency plans for every major superhero. He has blackmail files. He has people watching other people constantly. He represents this idea that the infrastructure required to live alongside beings of immense power would necessarily produce institutions that are cold and calculating in ways that a lot of superhero stories never acknowledge. Now close your eyes for a moment if you have not already. Just breathe. We are going to go somewhere quieter now. The Grayson household is the emotional center of the season, and there is so much lore baked into that family that it is worth spending time with. Nolan Grayson, the man who becomes Omni-Man, came to Earth decades before the show begins. He arrived as a Viltrumite warrior, part of a conquering alien empire, but over time he built a life here. He married Debbie, he had a son, he joined the superhero community, he wrote books about his travels. He genuinely, in some complicated and probably self-deceiving way, came to love the life he built on Earth. And that internal contradiction is what makes him the most tragic figure in Season 1. Viltrumites, the species that Nolan belongs to, are one of the most quietly terrifying elements of the lore. They are a near-extinct species, despite being one of the most powerful in the universe. At some point in their history, they decided to cull their own population, removing anyone who was not strong enough to meet their standards. The result is a species with almost no numbers, but extraordinary individual strength. Each one of them is essentially a walking extinction event for whatever planet they choose to target. Their entire civilization is built around expansion and conquest, but because there are so few of them, they have to operate methodically, sending individual agents to planets years or even decades in advance, letting those agents settle in, build trust, learn the terrain, and then prepare the ground for eventual conquest. Nolan was doing exactly this on Earth, even as he genuinely fell in love with the life he was living. Think about how long he waited. He was on Earth for decades. He watched Mark grow from a baby into a teenager. He joined the Guardians of the Globe. He did genuinely heroic things alongside people who trusted him completely, and the entire time there was this Viltrumite mission buried somewhere in his mind, waiting. The show never suggests he was pretending the whole time, which is actually more disturbing. He was not a spy coldly performing a role. He was a person genuinely living two incompatible truths at once, and eventually those truths collided with catastrophic results. Let your breathing slow down a little, in through the nose, out through the mouth. We are just exploring a story together. There is nothing urgent here. The Guardians of the Globe, before their fate in Episode 1, had been operating as the world's premier superhero team for a significant amount of time. Each member has backstory that the show only hints at, but the lore expands on considerably. Red Rush was a Soviet-era speedster who eventually shifted allegiances and became a genuinely trusted hero. War Woman was an Amazonian warrior from a hidden civilization. The Immortal had been alive for potentially thousands of years, having appeared throughout human history in various roles. Darkwing operated out of a city called Midnight City. Aquarius was a king of an underwater civilization. These were not just background characters waiting for a plot to happen to them. They were the culmination of decades of world history, and losing all of them in that first episode was not just shocking as a narrative choice, it was lore devastating. It removed centuries of combined experience and history from this world in a single night. And the way Cecil handles the aftermath is itself deeply layered with lore. He does not broadcast what happened to the general public immediately. He works to manage the information, to control how the world learns about the death of its greatest heroes, and to prevent the kind of panic that would result from people knowing that the most powerful hero on the planet had killed them all. Cecil has been navigating the space between public perception and hidden reality for his entire career, and the Guardian situation is just the most extreme version of a problem he deals with constantly. The teen team and their world is another layer of lore worth drifting through. Atom Eve, one of the most significant characters in the season, has abilities that even she does not fully understand at first. She can manipulate matter at a fundamental level, rearranging molecules to change the composition of essentially anything. The show reveals that her abilities were the result of deliberate government experimentation before she was born, part of a secret project to create super soldiers. Her parents, the people who raised her, were not her biological parents. Her origin is a quietly heartbreaking piece of lore that sits underneath her cheerful, capable exterior throughout the season. She is a person who was literally engineered, then handed off, then raised without knowing any of it, and she carries that without fully understanding why certain things feel slightly wrong about her life. Rexplode is another teen team member with more depth than the show initially grants him. His abilities involve charging objects with kinetic energy so they explode on contact. His background involves having been a ward of the government at a young age, recruited and trained rather than simply discovered. He is, in some ways, a product of the same system that created Eve, even if his experience of it was different. His relationship with Eve, and later with Mark, is complicated by the fact that he is genuinely aware of his own limitations and responds to that awareness in self-destructive ways that look like arrogance from the outside. William Clockwell, Mark's best friend, represents something really important in the lore, which is the perspective of an ordinary person in a superhero world. He does not have powers. He does not have access to classified information. He experiences the events of the season the way most people in this world would, through glimpses and rumors and sudden shocks. His subplot involving the missing student at school is actually a grounded human mystery running parallel to the cosmic horror of the main plot, and it grounds the show in a reality that makes everything else feel more meaningful. Take a slow breath, let the thoughts settle. You are doing great. The Mauler twins are a fascinating piece of lore that a lot of people gloss over because they appear to be simple villain characters, but their existence raises genuinely interesting questions about identity and individuality. They are clones, both of them, which means neither of them is technically the original. They have had this argument. There is a history of disagreement between them about which one came first, and the reason it matters is that their entire sense of self is built on the assumption that one of them has a legitimate claim to being the real person. The fact that they cannot definitively resolve the question is both played for dark comedy and is also quietly existentially terrifying when you sit with it. Dr. Seismic, Titan, Machine Head, and the various other villains in the season represent different layers of how crime and villainy function in a world with superheroes. Titan is particularly interesting because he is not simply a bad person. He is a man with genuinely good motivations, trying to protect his family from a dangerous criminal organization who makes choices that compromise his integrity along the way. He uses heroes instrumentally, manipulating them into helping him with his real agenda while pretending to be something he is not. He is, in some ways, a civilian version of what Nolan Grayson is doing on a cosmic scale. Both of them are presenting a version of themselves to people who trust them while pursuing a separate agenda underneath. The Flaxans are another piece of lore that rewards attention. They are an alien species from a dimension where time moves at a different rate than it does in ours. When they cross into our dimension, they begin aging rapidly, which is why their initial invasions end with them retreating and returning with technology that attempts to compensate for the time differential. Their persistence is lore-relevant because it shows that Earth is not just randomly targeted by alien threats. It is a known location in the broader universe, interesting to multiple species for multiple reasons. Earth in the Invincible universe is not a quiet backwater. It is a place that the wider universe is already paying attention to. The Sequids are another species introduced in the season that represent a different kind of threat. They are a hive-mind organism that can attach to and control other beings. The sequence involving the Martian mission reveals that humanity is actively reaching out into space, which means the threats that can reach Earth are not just those that actively seek it out. Humanity's own curiosity and expansion is opening doors to dangers they do not know how to evaluate yet. The astronaut who returns to Earth while infected is a slow-burn lore element that the season plants for future payoff. Now we are getting to the deep, quiet lore, the stuff that sits in the background of every scene. The world's understanding of where power comes from is genuinely varied in this universe. Some people get powers from scientific accidents. Some are born with them due to alien heritage. Some are recruited and enhanced deliberately by government programs. Some find objects or technology that grant abilities. Some come from hidden civilizations with long histories of power. The diversity of power origins means that the world has no unified theory of why superpowers exist, which mirrors the way real scientific paradigms work. People develop explanations that cover the cases they know about, and those explanations keep getting complicated by new discoveries. Amber Bennett, Mark's girlfriend, is a piece of lore that the show handles in a way worth examining. She is a thoughtful, driven person with her own moral commitments, particularly around social justice and community work. She volunteers, she advocates, she engages with the real problems of her city. And she spends most of the season being kept in the dark about who Mark really is. The tension between her values and her relationship is quietly building all season, and when she eventually discovers the truth, her reaction is shaped by everything the show has established about who she is. She is not angry because she was scared, she is angry because she was patronized. That distinction is a character depth thing that a lot of shows would not bother with. Let your body get heavier, sink into whatever you are lying on. The story is still here with you. The art style of the show is doing lore work that does not always get enough credit. The show deliberately presents itself in a relatively clean, accessible animation style for most of its runtime, and then periodically erupts into sequences of extreme graphic violence. That contrast is not just for shock value. It is a visual representation of the show's thematic argument, which is that the world that looks like a straightforward superhero story is actually concealing something much darker and more complicated. Every time the animation holds its clean, Saturday morning cartoon look and then suddenly becomes intensely brutal, it is the show demonstrating its own thesis. D.A. Sinclair is one of the most quietly disturbing characters in the season. He is a student, brilliant, and coldly logical, who has developed technology that allows him to convert living humans into cybernetic soldiers. His motivation is essentially utilitarian. He believes that human beings waste their lives and that his reanimant technology transforms the fallen and the forgotten into something useful. He does not experience remorse because his framework for ethics simply does not include conventional notions of human dignity. He represents a kind of horror that is different from alien invasion or supervillain ambition. He is the horror of a person with real intelligence and no appropriate moral constraints, applying that intelligence to human beings as if they were raw materials. Cecil's decision to eventually recruit him rather than imprison him permanently is one of the most morally complex choices in the season, and it is a choice the show presents without fully endorsing or condemning it. The Guardians of the Globe 2.0, assembled after the deaths of the original team, is a piece of lore about institutional recovery and legacy. Cecil needs to replace the most important superhero team in the world quickly, because the world cannot know that the original team was destroyed, and because the threats that the team used to handle are still very much ongoing. He assembles a group that includes veterans, newcomers, people who have things to prove, and people who are there partly because they are controllable. Robot, who leads this new team, is himself a mystery for much of the season. His leadership is methodical and effective, but also strangely detached, and the revelation about his true nature, that he is a young person with a severely physically limited body who operates the robot as a remote proxy, reframes everything about how he has been navigating the season. He has been running a superhero team while managing a physical reality that most people around him do not know about. His eventual plan to give himself a new body by working with the Mauler twins is ethically troubling but deeply humanly motivated. He wants to live fully. He wants a body that works. That is not a villain motivation, it is a tragic one. Monster Girl, another member of the New Guardians, has one of the most quietly devastating power sets in the show. She can transform into a massive, powerful monster form, but every time she transforms, she ages backward. She is perpetually young in appearance because she has transformed hundreds of times, each instance costing her some of her biological age. She is a teenager who has been a hero for long enough that she should be an adult. Her power is literally consuming her future. She uses it anyway because she believes in what the team is doing, because she wants to be useful, and possibly because she does not have many other options. That is a lore detail that is heartbreaking if you actually let yourself think about it. Breathe slowly. You are drifting a little now. Stay with the story. The relationship between Mark and his father is the spine of the entire season, and the lore surrounding it is rich with things the show communicates without directly stating. Nolan spent years preparing Mark for the possibility of getting powers. He trained him, worked out with him, shared his understanding of what strength means. On the surface, this looked like fatherhood. Underneath it was mission preparation. The question the show leaves deliberately open is how much Nolan was performing fatherhood and how much he was genuinely being a father. The answer it seems to arrive at is that both things were true at once, and that Nolan himself could not fully separate them. He loved his son. He was also preparing his son to help subjugate humanity. Both of those things lived in him simultaneously, and he never resolved the contradiction. When Nolan finally reveals his true mission to Mark, the scene has a specific lore texture worth examining. He does not present it as a betrayal. In his mind, he is offering Mark the truth and an opportunity to join something larger. He frames human civilization as temporary and small compared to the Viltrumite Empire. He talks about how in time, from the perspective of their lifespans, humanity's current struggles will seem like nothing. He is not lying when he says this, from his frame of reference. But the framing is doing something monstrous, which is asking Mark to abandon his own humanity by pointing out that his Viltrumite side makes him partly alien. He is trying to convince his son that the people he loves are not really his people. And Mark refuses, but the refusal costs him enormously. The fight between Mark and Nolan is not just physically devastating, it is the lore payoff for everything the season has been building. Every quiet moment between father and son, every training session, every book Nolan wrote about Earth, every conversation Debbie thought they were having in good faith, it all arrives at this brutal and devastating collision. And when Nolan leaves Earth rather than kill his son, when he flies away crying and cannot bring himself to finish what the Viltrumite mission requires, it is the show's acknowledgement that even within the logic of an alien empire, love can create something that ideology cannot fully extinguish. Let yourself drift a little further. The harder parts of the story are behind us. We are in the quiet space now. The aftermath of Nolan's departure creates a specific law situation for Earth. The planet is now known to the Viltrumite Empire as a partially prepared target with a failed agent. That means eventual follow-up is essentially certain. The season is not just telling the story of a superhero origin, it is setting up the beginning of an existential conflict between humanity and an alien empire, filtered through the most personal possible lens, a son whose father is the enemy. Cecil's response to learning the truth about Nolan involves rapidly recalibrating his understanding of every interaction he ever had with Omni-Man. He had contingency plans for Nolan, but those plans were built on the assumption that Nolan was a hero who might, under extreme circumstances, need to be stopped. The reality is that Nolan was a long-term infiltrator for an alien empire, which means the contingency plans were inadequate in ways Cecil now has to rapidly address. The rebuilding of Earth's defenses, the expansion of the GDA's capabilities, the recruitment of morally grey assets like Sinclair, all of this is Cecil trying to close gaps that he did not fully know existed until it was almost too late. The show also plants lore about the broader universe that Season 1 does not fully pay off. There are hints about the coalition of planets, a loose alliance of worlds that resist Viltrumite expansion. There are hints about how many Viltrumites are actually still alive, and how many are already embedded in other planets doing what Nolan was doing on Earth. There is a universe full of stakes that extends beyond what any single season can fully explore, and the deliberate restraint the show uses in revealing this is one of its best lore decisions. It knows that a well-placed implication is more affecting than a full explanation. Your breathing is slower now. Good. Stay here with me just a little longer. The final image of Nolan floating alone in deep space is a piece of lore, as much as it is an emotional beat. It is the image of an entity who has billions of years of potential life ahead of him, who has just destroyed the closest thing he allowed himself to have to a home, who is carrying the weight of a choice that both followed his programming and shattered something real inside him. He is not sympathetic in the way that excuses what he did, but he is comprehensible in the way that makes him tragic, and tragedy in fiction is one of the most powerful tools for processing the complicated things about real life, the people who love us imperfectly, the institutions that protect us while compromising their own integrity, the way large forces shape small lives without the small lives fully knowing it. Season 1 of Invincible is a show about a boy becoming a hero. It is also a show about colonialism, about inherited identity, about the violence hidden inside systems that present themselves as protective. It is a show about how love functions inside people who are also capable of terrible things. It is a show about what it means to choose your own values when the person who raised you is trying to tell you that those values are a mistake. And all of that lore, all of that texture, all of that carefully constructed fictional reality is still here when you close your eyes. You carry it with you now, those images of a world both familiar and strange, a teenager learning to fly, a father looking back at a planet he was supposed to conquer and could not leave behind, a woman realizing that the life she thought she understood was built on a foundation of secrets, a director sitting in an underground bunker making calculations about acceptable loss. The world keeps turning, the stars are where they always were. Mark Grayson will put his costume on again tomorrow. Somewhere out in the deeper universe, the Viltrumite Empire is still there, ancient and patient and powerful, waiting for the next opportunity. And somewhere between the action and the consequence, between the violence and the quiet moments of ordinary life, between the lies people tell to protect others and the truths that eventually break through, there is just a story being told, and you have heard it now, all of it. The hidden pieces and the loud moments, the lore that lives in the background, the world building that makes the emotion land the way it does. You know why it matters, you know what it is actually about, and that knowledge is something you can take with you into sleep, turning it over slowly in your mind, the way you might turn a smooth stone in your hand. The Grayson house is quiet now. Debbie is probably sitting somewhere in the wreckage of understanding, rebuilding her sense of everything, Mark is healing, physically and otherwise. Cecil is making lists. Robot is planning something. Atom Eve is looking at the world and asking herself what she wants it to become. The team is figuring out what comes next. And somewhere in Midnight City, and under the ocean, and in all the places where ordinary people live, without knowing how close extraordinary things have passed, life continues in the comfortable, rumbling, everyday way that life does. Let all of that settle into the quiet corners of your mind. There is no urgency here. There is nowhere you need to be. The story has been told. The law has been laid out like a landscape you can wander through as long as you want, and all of it is gentle now, distant, safe, curious, interesting in the way that good fiction always is when you are holding it from a comfortable distance. Let your eyes stay closed if they are already closed. Let the images from the season drift through your memory in whatever order they come. The colors of the animation, the sound of the music, the texture of a world that is almost like ours but not quite. Let all of it be something soft now, a background hum of a story you know well. You are safe. The show is paused. The universe is patient. And sleep is very, very close.